All right, so chapter 40, as it's loading here nice and slowly, is going to look at population ecology. So we'll be looking at populations of organisms in the communities and what various factors impact the size of these populations. So, the study of population ecology looks at these populations, these groups of organisms that are living together. When we talk about a population, we're looking at the same species. So we're looking at how they interact with one another and then also their environments. So things change the densities of populations, basically, how many organisms there are within that population. Couple of obvious ones: births and deaths. Individuals being born increase the numbers in that population, deaths decrease it. Immigrants are organisms from a different population entering a population. Emigrants are leaving the population that you're looking at and moving elsewhere. So, all of these factors can change the number of organisms in a population. So, one of the things that we look at within population ecology is how fast can a population actually grow? And we see that it can grow extraordinarily quickly, but it can't keep that pace forever. So when we look at this, the biotic potential, this is the maximum rate in which a population can increase. So if everything is perfect, there's food available, there's habitat available, there's no predators keeping the population down, then they're going to increase as fast as they possibly can. This is their biotic potential. Okay. However, in reality, this is never going to happen. We have environmental resistances. So there are limited amounts of food, limited amount of space. Organisms will compete with other species for food. They'll compete with each other. They'll have predators. Disease exists. And so there are things that keep organisms from realizing these biotic potentials, from growing at these maximum rates. Okay. And so the growth is limited by the environment that they live in. Okay. So there are density dependent factors that will limit growth. And these density dependent factors, as the name suggests, is dependent on the density. So the more individuals there are in a population, the stronger the impact these factors will have. So food availability. The more organisms that are in a population, the less food availability per individual. Okay? And once you get too many individuals, the food's going to be all gone. Organisms are going to start dying. Shelter, so habitat, places to live. There's only so many places for these organisms to find shelter. Waste buildup. Now, this isn't typically something that we think of when we think of organisms that are roaming large areas. But if you've ever grown bacteria or seen bacteria grow in a petri dish, this is going to be a density dependent factor. If you get a lot of bacteria growing, their waste products are going to start building up, and eventually bacteria are going to start dying because of all the waste that is there. And then disease. The more organisms there are in a population, the easier it is for disease to spread through that population, get individuals sick, and kill them. So these are our major density dependent factors, things that are impacted based on how many organisms there are in the population. So what we see related to these density dependent factors, right? And so we've got this biotic potential. This is our exponential growth, the maximum rate. If everything's perfect, this is what's going to happen with organisms. However, in reality, because environmental resistances exist, we get logistic growth, where we start getting density dependent factors at some point in this growth, where the amount of food available starts decreasing. The amount of shelter available decreases, disease starts to spread, and so on. And so we start to see a decrease in the rate of growth until it gets to a point where it's steady. And this is the maximum number of individuals that this particular habitat can sustain. This is how much food is available. This is the amount of shelter available. and we can house this many individuals in this particular area. And this is referred to as the carrying capacity. This is the maximum number of individuals this particular environment can sustain. If you get above that, you're going to start having some issues, and we'll see that. We also see that there are density independent factors. These are things that are going to limit populations or decrease populations regardless of how many individuals there are. You get a meteorite come down. Okay, that's going to kill a bunch of individuals. Doesn't matter how many there are. Earthquakes, climate, all of these abiotic factors can kill individuals without it mattering how many there are. Human interactions, this image here is an oil spill. So all of that oil is going to kill a lot of these marine animals. And it doesn't matter how many there are, it's going to kill a bunch of them. Okay. So we see that density-dependent factors and density-independent factors interact to determine the fate of a population. Okay, so whether that population persists, disappears, grows, whatever it might be. So here our example, we're going to look at a population of reindeer. They were introduced to St. Matthew Island in 1944. And so what we see is that there were no predators here. There was food available for the deer that were introduced here. And so we saw exponential growth. But then there was a very harsh winter, very little food available. And so as you can imagine, we have this very strong density dependent factor. A lot of individuals died. So they were introduced in 1944, as we can see down here. In the carrying capacity that's been essentially calculated for this island and reindeer is just a couple of hundred. Okay, maybe 500, probably a little bit less. Okay, but there was food available at the time. And so in the course of about 20 years, we saw this explosion in population up to 6,000. Okay, but this is going to damage the plants that live there. And eventually they're not going to be there for them to continue eating. And so they overshot their carrying capacity pretty significantly. And then they had this harsh winter where there was very little food available. And so we see this huge decline over a short period of time where these reindeer were just dying off because there was no food for them. And then their population could never recover from this because their environment was significantly altered because of how many reindeer there were at one time. The food availability never really bounced back. The population of reindeer couldn't bounce back. And so they died off. Okay. And so this kind of transitions into us looking at humans. How many people can the earth actually support? And why does this answer actually change? So we see early on in human history, okay, 5,000 BC or so, we developed agriculture. And so because humans didn't really need to compete at the same level for food, we increased our carrying capacity. And we see that in industrialized nations, in the modern world, agriculture is much easier now. It doesn't take 100 people to farm 100 acres, right? You could get one person farming 1,000 or more acres because of our technologies. So we're able to produce more food. Our carrying capacity goes up. This is a video by Hans Rosling. It's very interesting. It looks at lifespan and wealth of various countries over the last 200 years and how that has changed, especially as we look at things like industrialization. So I encourage you to watch this video. Some populations will cycle between being large and then being small. Locusts are one, if you've ever heard of this. There are years where they just won't be a big deal. And then there are years where they will just explode in population and there will be millions of them and they'll devastate crops. And so we get these huge changes in population. Okay, in the next video, I'll start here at boom and bust cycles.